We're live.
Okay.
Yay. I'm just turning off things because I forgot to not make noise. Today I'm here with Jennifer Grossman. She's a senior research scientist at Wellesley Center for Women at Wellesley College. And her research is focused on adolescent development and sexual health, with particular emphasis on how teens and their families talk about dating, sex, and relationships. So your most recent study is about how to best support LGBTQ teens when it comes to talking about sex and relationships. And what's the most interesting finding from that study?
Yeah, great. Well, I think one thing we often talk about is that, parents and especially moms are like the educator, the primary person who needs to talk to teens about sex and relationship. And I think this study really challenges that notion. What we find is for sexual minority teens, it's not just mom. There's some dad influence, but even more central to them is over 40% of them are reporting talk with another non-parental family member. So it might be an older brother or sister, an older cousin, an aunt or uncle. And older sisters are the second most common person who they come out to about their sexual orientation after mom. So I think it can give parents some hope in terms of thinking this isn't just about you, that there's a wider family support network that particularly sexual minority teens are already using to learn about sex and relationships and to share their experiences around their sexual orientation.
I mean, I really feel so relieved hearing it. And I know I'm not alone in feeling like I let my kids down in that, like I know it's not the talk, but having talks and feeling like I handled, my husband and I both handled it well. It's just kind of daunting. And you don't, the boundaries of where you go and what you talk about always seem so complicated, but it's such a relief not to have it all be burdened on us.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you first before we go further is you use the word sexual minorities.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that? And also, why do you use that language?
That's a great question. So the way we define sexual minority youth, and this is from a survey that we did with teens, is the question that we ask is, who are you attracted to? And then we give a bunch of different options. So teens who took the survey who say they're attracted to the same sex, they're not sure, both sexes or neither, are all put in this category of sexual minority. So it's saying you're not confident that you're straight or heterosexual. So that's the sexual minority category. So sexual minority, there isn't one definition. So people all define it differently. So it's really important that you're asking, what do you mean by it? When I looked up a recent study of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which surveys high school students nationally, the way they ask the question is, do high school teens identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual? And they found about 8% of high school teens in the US identify that way. So it makes sense that our numbers, which are 13% in our study, so it's a higher number because our definition is more inclusive, it's broader. So it's teens who aren't confident that they're straight. So it gives us sort of a wider window into teens' orientation than some studies which focus in more on teens who have already decided for sure that they identify in a certain way.
So it's more like questioning, right? Like I could be anywhere in that conversation and questioning,
right?
And I would fall into sexual minorities.
Exactly, for this study. But it's really important when you're looking at data and you're thinking, sexual minority, how do they define it? Because there is not one set definition, and it's going to give you different kinds of information.
It's interesting because I know a lot of times in the conversation that I have a gay kid, and so I often have people calling up and wanting to have a conversation about what it was like, and they'll say to me, she's too young to know, or like someone just put in the comments, many are still figuring out their sexuality, and that is entirely true, Sherry. For a lot of adolescents, that could be true, but it also, do you think that sometimes parents are looking for a response that says, don't label it yet?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And we know a lot of young people don't necessarily come out until they're 20, 25. I think the ages are getting a little bit younger, and men tend to come out, or male teens, earlier than women. But yeah, it takes time for an individual to know their own identity, but also parents, they're not teens often haven't shared that yet. They're still kind of figuring out who they are, and it's hard to talk about that stuff, especially when you don't fit in a majority identity. So yeah, absolutely. I think a key for parents is just not making an assumption about what your teen's sexual orientation is, and kind of being open to the possibility that, they may not be the orientation you think. And particularly, a lot of parents assume, oh, well, I haven't seen that my teen is gay, so they must be straight. And a lot of times as parents, we don't know. So just when you're having those conversations, just kind of have in the back of your mind, oh, I'm not sure. So maybe I can take a second and pause before I make a comment. Oh, you'll have a boyfriend someday, to your daughter. And it's like, well, we don't know. So, just be open to those questions.
I mean, I'm sure because of the work you do that flows easier out of your mouth than it does for most of us who go, we're the wrong generation. We approach this from the assumption of something, and then we steer differently if we're told. But it is a really nice thing to say whoever you fall in love with. But it's a flip. It's kind of not how we grew up. So
it is. And sometimes now, I mean, our kids are more fluent with language, transgender, genderqueer than our generation. I think that probably happens with most generations. I think something that reassures me about parenting, because I put my foot in my mouth all the time. I talk with my son and I realize, oh, why did I say that? Is that we can say, whoops. It's not the talk, right? We're having multiple conversations all the time. We make mistakes in parenting all the time. You say, you know what? I noticed that I used that language that was like, oh, like your girlfriend someday. And I realized, we don't actually know. Like, we might have a friend who might be gay. And, so you can use these reference points, and you can also acknowledge your mistakes and say, I'm still learning this stuff. So, I think our kids learn as much from us being open about our process and our mistakes and our own learning as they do about us being sort of the perfect parent. Like, none of us is that, and we're not mostly sex educators in our careers. We're not mostly researchers on sex, and I think getting it right is overrated. It's really about a process of working toward something, and owning your mistakes.
Yeah, that's such a great point. How forgiving our kids are when we get it wrong, and when we say it. Like, it's a really forgiving profession, parenting. Okay, so you did mention who teens talk to in their family about sex and about coming out. Can you address a little bit, like, you actually have findings on who's the number one, number two, and how that
Sure.
works?
Sure. So coming out, so teens sharing their sexual orientation with people in their families, for both male and female teens, the mom is the number one person. And about, out of our sample of a little under 1,000 11th and 12th grade teens, just under 50% reported, yeah, mom is our person, someone who we've talked to. The second person, which I mentioned earlier, which I found so interesting for both boys and girls, is an older sister. And I think we start to see some research out there suggesting that big sisters play a big role, not just for sexual minority youth, but maybe in this case, particularly for sexual minority youth, in being a comfortable person to talk with around identity. And maybe, is more of the teens generation. So maybe, like you were saying about some parents are a little more old school, might be a little more comfortable with things like sexuality and relationships. Where it starts to differ a little bit is the number three person in terms of coming out. So for boys, it's dad. And for girls, it's an older female cousin. So you start to see where there's some commonalities, that mom and sister, top two, and then there's some splits by gender. But again, thinking about this is not just about the dyad of the mom and the teen. It's a much bigger picture. We also tend to see that boys' networks for coming out are bigger within the family than girls, which is really interesting to me. And that was a little bit surprising. So boys are more likely to have talked with more family members about their orientation. Part of that might be that boys know their own orientation a little bit sooner. It may be that girls are more likely to form a couple of close connections in their family rather than have like more wider connections, people they trust. But that's something that I think it'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about.
That is really interesting. So in that list, what do you think the takeaway is for parents in the story of hearing that the older siblings are important, that the cousins are important? What's the takeaway?
Okay, good question. I think one takeaway goes back to what I said before, is that you don't have to do this alone. To think about, I would say every parent, think about who's the network within your family. And you could also think beyond the family, but I think in this case, we're focusing on family in this study. Who are the people who you trust? And how can you encourage and support their connections with that teen so that you don't have to be the only voice? Ideally, you might check in. We see from some of these extended family members when we talk to them, some of them describe, oh yeah, sometimes the mom will turf a question to them and say, I'm noticing something about the teen that I'm a little bit concerned about. I raised it and the teen was a little sensitive about it. Would you mind following up so we can work together on this? And other times, parents might be a little more reluctant and uncomfortable talking about these. And so a teen might go to a sibling as someone who seems a little more accessible to them. So I would say for parents, kind of trust that there's sometimes you have larger networks than you might realize who are supporting the teen's health. But also, if you can, I'd say reach out and collaborate and make those connections so that you can really work as a team. You don't need to do everything yourself. So think about, here's some pieces I can do. Oh, but maybe my daughter can do a little bit more of this work with her younger brother in a way that can help support her.
I wonder in that story if there's any sense that, like, especially for the mom who's we've just announced mom is number one, right? But let's just say that was only 50%. So let's say your kid told a relative before they told you.
Yeah.
A little bit of a sense, at least in our culture right now, like that good relationships mean your kids tell you everything.
Yeah.
So as a mom, I think I would maybe have a hurt feeling, like a little bit of a betrayal that you didn't feel close enough to me to tell me, but you went to cousin so-and-so. So how do we deal with that as parents?
Well, I think first is acknowledge that it's a little painful. You might feel a little left out. And I think those feelings are natural. So I think kind of owning that feeling and saying, yeah, I'm a little hurt that they didn't reach out to me. But I think there's an and there, which is also feeling like, parents have so much resonance and meaning for teens. And sometimes maybe even just doing like a sibling might be a trial balloon. It might be a way to kind of start exploring and naming that without kind of the resonance that this person who is mom, who is often the closest person in teen's life, it may be that they need to kind of build up to having that conversation. And so I think really supporting teens while feeling a little hurt, but still recognizing, wow, there are these great resources in these teens' lives. I want to be an open person who I make it clear to my team that I'm available. I'm not going to judge them. I want to be here to support them, and giving them the space and the support within the family to find their own way to sharing when they're ready.
Great. Can I ask a question that we just got from Sarah? My 13-year-old came out as bi this summer to my husband, her dad, and I this summer. We were supportive, but as COVID rages on, she is so isolated. How can I best support her?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's a time where a lot of teens are feeling isolated. A lot of times they're not in school. They're not able to see people in person. We have so many safety worries. I think this is a time where, and particularly someone who's bi may be even more isolated. I think looking for social networks. Are there people within her circle that she can connect with? Looking for wider networks for teens online that you want to see what they are first to make sure it's something that has supportive messages, kind of like online support groups type thing. But I think trying to get those connections and to think, how do we get them that aren't always in person? Because sometimes that's just not possible in these times.
There's also an organization for parents called PFLAG.
Yeah.
And it's really wonderful support, Sarah. So you might want to check them out, and you'll be able to ask that question there, and parents will tell you how they're helping their kids. And that there might be a network offshoot of that for the kids also. So PFLAG. Okay, back to your research. Does the sexual orientation of a child impact how often parents discuss dating and sex?
Yeah, great question. Just to pull back for a minute and look at the larger literature out there, we know from a lot of studies that sexual minority teens just don't have as many conversations with their parents about sex and relationships as straight teens. And we also know that when they do talk, often parents are talking in pretty what we call heteronormative ways with those teens. So they might talk about a boyfriend and girlfriend. They might talk about like, make sure you don't have babies when you have sex. So things that might not always be relevant for a teen who's not straight. So that's kind of the broader context. In our study, we found that the sexual minority teens were less likely to talk with their fathers than the straight teens were. So we know that generally moms talk more with teens. That's for straight teens, for gay teens, no matter which teens. Moms are more often the ones who are talking about sex and relationships. But the difference here was with the dads. So among the heterosexual teens, 32% of them reported that they were talking with dad in some form about sex and relationships. Only 23% of the sexual minority teens in our sample said they were talking with dad. So, it could be that if dad knows that his teen is a sexual minority, he might be kind of more uncomfortable. Sometimes parents don't know what to say. They're like, I don't have the words to do it. Our sample is also about half our teens were from Latinx families, and there may be some cultural pieces around feeling like that's not a comfortable thing to be doing. Also, in our study, we found that while moms were talking, equally likely to talk to their sexual minority or straight teens about sex, they were less likely to talk to their sexual minority teens about protection. So things like HIV, things like STDs, and that's a meaningful thing. Now, part of that may be about pregnancy, because if your teen, is gay, pregnancy is not the same kind of issue that it is for a straight teen. But really important for moms to be having those conversations about HIV and about STDs with their sexual minority teens.
It's interesting though, there is a discomfort. So how do you overcome the discomfort? Like if you don't know quite how to have the conversation for your heterosexual kids, but at least, that's something you've grown up thinking about.
Yeah.
Are there resources or suggestions?
Yeah, when I was Googling this the other day, just like parent guides for talking to sexual minority teens, and you have to see, because these websites come from all different places, but like Johns Hopkins Medicine has a good site that if you Google it, that talks about, okay, here are a few things to do. I looked up the verywellfamily.com, a parent's guide to talking to LGBTQ teens. So I think there are resources out there. So just take the time, look it up. And again, don't be afraid to get things wrong. So many parents we talk to are uncomfortable in general talking with teens about sex and relationships, right? It's hard. Like this is a really hard task of parenting. And it's even harder, I think, if a teen doesn't fit with what you grew up with. So I think forgiving ourselves for making mistakes, for getting things wrong, for not saying the right words. And I think you can tell your teen, God, I'm awkward about this. I don't know how to say it. Some people talk about asking your teens, like, who might be transgender, like, oh, how do you call yourself? Like, what do you want me to call you? You don't have to say, oh, I know already. So sometimes just asking teens the questions and acknowledging that you're uncomfortable, that's fine. There's not a rule you need to be comfortable. It's just find a way to engage with the conversation and think about, well, that didn't go quite as well as I planned. Okay, let's give yourself a few days, take a shower, get some chocolate and then try again. Give yourself what you need to kind of stay in that conversation over time.
So I would say I got it wrong with all of my kids, regardless of their sexual orientation often. But one thing was that when I enlisted my son, who's gay, when I enlisted his help to understand, he was very forthcoming, which was really nice. But then I had to step back and say, I kind of had to have a check of whether I would ask my other kids the same question, because he was so open and willing to talk to me that I thought, sometimes I encroached on questions that I thought maybe weren't even appropriate.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think another speaker on your site talked about like the difference between kind of curiosity and like critical health questions. And I think that's a good one because there are things we just are really interested to know about our kids, but we don't need to know them, right? And then there are other things that are basic about their health and safety. So I think kind of sitting with yourself and thinking, is this something I need to know? But also our kids, like, well, you know this, every kid is going to be different. So just because they grow up in the family doesn't mean they have the same comfort or the same level of shyness or privacy. So I think part of how we learn is we try things out. And one of your kids might be like, oh, chat, let's talk about this. And another might be like slamming the door in your face and saying, kill me now. I don't want to talk about this. So it doesn't mean you should never talk to that kid again who slams the door. But I think you have a sense of, oh, this is not a one size fits all model. So think about what are the most critical things I want to convey. And it may be with one of your kids, you can go way beyond that and talk about all sorts of interesting, engaging, connecting things. And that with another kid who's really pushing back against that, you think, what are the top 3 things I want to share with them, and let all the rest go. So I think it's a learn as you go kind of process.
Yeah, that's a great point. To pick the top 3 things. So Becky asked a question that's perfect for you, Jennifer, because you actually answered it for us on our website. If you go to yourteenmag.com and you type in Jennifer Grossman, you're going to get an answer to Becky's question, but now you'll get it from Jennifer directly. How would you handle a lesbian teen who wants to have friends stay the night?
Yeah, it's a great question, and not a simple answer. I think a lot of it is having the conversation with them around, how are you thinking about this? Like, is this a lesbian teen who's just wanting to have a sleepover with girls who are friends? Or is this someone who wants to have a sleepover with someone they're interested in? And kind of how might you and they think together about that? I think another thing I mentioned on your site is don't be afraid to set a boundary too. Like, if you're really not comfortable with that, you can say, I'm not comfortable with that. Kind of, and talk to them about your reasoning, and also listen to their response. When they say that's not fair, or you can think about how to navigate these things, and that there is not one answer. And it's not that if you say no, you can't do this, you're a bad parent. Yes, you're a good parent, or vice versa. And I think issues of consent come up here too. If your child is in a potential kind of romantic or sexual situation, how do they know what they're comfortable? What are you looking for tonight in this sleepover? Are you hoping that there's going to be something romantic there? Are you clear you don't want it? Well, what do you do in ambiguous situations? And how do you get clear what you want as a teen? I mean, these are issues that are so critical to how teens identify and take care of their own safety and connection and relationship. So not an easy answer, but I think really good opportunities to parent the way we always do, to stay with the boundaries that you need to stay with, but also to have a real conversation around how are they thinking about this and what are the added complexities given their bisexuality.
Okay, Jennifer Grossman, it's a tough topic for us. We're glad you're doing the research and sharing it with us. And thanks so much for being here with us today.
This is such a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.